recording so I don't forget. I think our sound sounds very good now.
It does.
So
Okay.
yeah, so that's great. And I am going to go ahead then on your whatever device you have for Clubhouse, turn it on, but then just turn the sound all the way
Volume
down.
down, right?
Yeah. And I'm going to just start pinging people into the room in case they would like to listen in. I'm just going to ping everyone who happens to be online right now. A lot of people on Clubhouse this morning.
Oh man,
All right.
really?
Yeah. Just a lot of green dots there. Hi, Mohammed. Thank you for joining. Hi, Dr. Cindy. Thank you for joining. I'm going to be recording the podcast live with Clarissa Silva. So the first part of it, we won't be necessarily engaging with the audience, but for the next 30 to 40 minutes, once Clarissa pops into the room, we'll just start the podcast. This is for the 6% with Nancy MD podcast. We have two people in our audience at the moment. So let me see if I'm going to ping you, Clarissa.
Yeah, please, because I don't even see it.
It should be if you go to my events.
It's gone. Yeah,
Oh, that's so strange. Okay,
I know.
let me text you a link.
Okay.
And thanks to those in the audience for standing by. Clarissa, I am live on Clubhouse, but I won't repeat your phone number. If you just tell it to me right now, it's just going into my headphones. Tell me your phone number and I'll text it to you.
It's 718-541-2752.
All right. I just sent you the link. So hopefully that brings you in. Thank you, Mohammed and Dr. Cindy, for standing by. Once we get started with the podcast, we will record for about 30 minutes for the interview portion. Then we'll open it up to Q&A if you are interested. So I'll see if I'll give Clarissa a second to try to pop in. Is that link working on your phone?
It's not.
Oh, how strange.
Oh man, this is like a crazy.
It's like a crazy tech morning.
I know. And I've been looking forward to this. Just then I'm like, all right. This app should just be a little bit friendlier.
Yeah, I would definitely say that like Clubhouse doesn't always have the friendliest ways to search rooms.
Oh, you know where I could pull it from? My own Twitter.
Oh, yes.
Oh, man. Cindy's so cute. She sent me a link.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Cindy. I love it.
Okay. It says join the room.
Oh, there you are.
Thank you so much.
Success. Okay. And so
thank you, Dr. Cindy.
Yeah. All right. So you can so Clarissa, I see that you're muted on Clubhouse, but you can unmute there.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
And to everyone in the room, we will just start in just a moment. I am recording on Zoom here, and just make sure that your volume is all the way down on your phone. You good?
Yes, I'm lowering the volume.
All right. And then at the 30, 40 minute mark, then we'll go ahead and unmute, or actually we'll allow hand raising there and let folks ask questions. So Clarissa, I will have given an intro from which I'll pull from your bio, and we'll go ahead and jump into the recording part of the podcast. And I'll pause for a second and then we'll get going. I am so excited to have you here with me, Clarissa Silva. I just gave an introduction of you, but I would love to welcome you and have you tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I so appreciate it. And thank you all for being here, both on the podcast and Zoom. I'm a behavioral scientist and entrepreneur, and I am specialized in infectious disease and psych. And I create solutions in brain health, emotional wellness for the healthcare and corporate sectors.
I always like to start with my guests by asking them about what their childhood was like. And with your background in psych, it's kind of like lay down on the couch. Tell me about your childhood. But I love hearing about origin stories because I think it just says so much about the things that bring us to where we are now. So tell me what it was like being Clarissa growing up where you did and your experiences at that time.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. That's a great exploratory question. So I'm Brazilian, and I grew up in the Bronx, New York. So my background is like immigrant parents, so I didn't have that many options as career. So the cream of the crop for my parents were doctors and lawyers, and the secondary would be science or engineering. But even engineering was kind of out of the reach for us as women growing up. So you know, I I was definitely interested in science more than any other area. Um, so I began my interest in infectious disease because while I was in high school, I had friends who passed away from HIV/AIDS, and those were that was a series in the 1990s, early 90s of women in my life that I lost, and at that point, we didn't understand enough about women and infection, and we certainly didn't explore different things that would lead people to infection or just risk. Or so HIV/AIDS was a big deal for me because I when we were all like 17, 18, 19, 20, right, at that time, to lose as many friends, and because there was so much shame around disease and there was so much unknown around disease, most of the families that experienced this with their daughters were very secretive of what was occurring for them. So, we didn't really know how they passed away. Sometimes we weren't even allowed to go to their funerals. So for a different series of years, I just was really perplexed just about the the lack of understanding around gender and disease and the shame that was attached to you know what we were seeing at the time, and we knew very little at the time.
Mhm.
So my when I went into behavioral science, we didn't have behavioral science as a division exploring anything, but I was super fortunate that the University of Michigan had a joint program. It was one of the few in the country that had a joint program that you could pursue behavioral science, looking at it from a risk modeling perspective, disease perspective, um, out of the medical school. So I was super fortunate to be able to do that joint program at Michigan and be specialized in one of the first cohorts in our country to look at behavioral science and look at disease from a very different lens than we had approached before. And certainly HIV/AIDS lent us a lot of opportunity to explore many, many different areas. And at that time, so this is 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, the infancy of looking at behavioral science from this disease lens was very, very novel. And the approaches were all very, very new. So I was fortunate to be able to explore different aspects of disease area, right? I was able to work on treatment sides, intervention sides, prevention sides of disease, and, work through, that was, I would say 15, 16 years that I was in infectious disease, just exploring different things that I wanted answers for back in the 90s, gendered health, risk factors, and, really social determinants of health as we understand it now. So
Mhm.
that's my brief intro into behavioral science and disease.
You mentioned when you were growing up as a Latina that it was often, maybe there's the thought that girls and science don't necessarily go together. And how did you navigate sometimes that which is presented to you? What is possible for a woman in these fields. What was that like? And did with your role models, did you have people that showed you that this was possible? Um, and how did you make that leap into behavioral science?
So unfortunately, I didn't have role models, and so the one thing that I will say is the framework for me was that I I was navigating American culture
Hmm.
as a immigrant kid. So my parents didn't want us to assimilate. My parents didn't want us to acculturate, right? They still held values of traditional Brazilian society, but all we did was transplant it to the US. So for my parents, it 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 was more about excelling and exceeding standards more than it was about what you don't see. So I think, I would say, the one single driver of everything for me was always I had to be a trailblazer, right? Because my parents were trying to understand American culture while I was understanding American culture. So I was constantly navigating for both of us, right? And even learning English. I learned English as my third language. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Watching PBS to kind of navigate. So a lot of it was always me navigating systems that I had no idea of. My parents had no idea of. So in a way, it does engender that trailblazing. It does engender that cutting edge. It does, and you're not as fearful as you would have been if you would have thought like, okay, let me add assimilation, let me add acculturation to
Hmm.
everything, let me add like layers of what I need to see in the future. So when I
Hmm.
was in high school, I didn't see behavioral science yet. So I got involved in HIV AIDS work back then, right? Like, and then, Nancy, it was all quarantine wards where nobody was, I was walking through Cornell and Columbia hospitals to enhance quality of life, right? As my last year's thesis project in high school, right? I still didn't see a future yet. So one of the things that I will always say is, as a woman of color in the US, I always have said this as the constant throughout my life now is that the like ideal circumstances won't always exist. You'll have to create them. So when I went to Michigan and I was able to do a behavioral science track where it didn't really exist, I had to petition for everything. I wound up getting a Ford and Fogarty fellowship and did my residency in Costa Rica, right? But at every step of the way, I had to petition for the different things that I wanted to occur, the advisors, the track, even the international residency, those hours counting towards my residency. Like every single thing, I had to get in the pit and fight for it. So I got used to getting into the pit and fighting for it. And I got used to, there's many things going against me for sure. I mean, my ethnicity wasn't going to hand me anything, right? So a lot of these things, it's part where you overcome and you become you honestly become very disempowered, Nancy. You do, right? Like,
Mhm.
and that disempowerment becomes a definition for how to cope with the world as you get older, right?
Mhm.
So that level of, okay, my personal excellence, my personal standard of excellence, I just, when I was young, from high school all the way through my 30s, I always said it won't matter what I outperform. I still won't be recognized in the way that others will. So that's not going to be a factor for me. What I have to do is outperform my own standard. There isn't competition. It's me outperforming everything that I set as a goal. And when I get those things, that helps me. And, all of my life, I have done research on health disparities on Black and Latino communities. So I always saw that the true advancement of understanding why our lives were truncated, why we're undervalued, why we're underpaid, was always to just try to advance up science, healthcare, communities, right? So for me, it wasn't, it wasn't just the advocacy part, but it was always more of, in order for us to excel as communities, we have to start setting these standards and bars and just keep fighting, right? I mean, like when I was in HIV/AIDS, I had to consistently fight for gendered health. I had to consistently fight for social determinants of health. So that that one part of childhood, like having to learn English through Spanish translation to Portuguese translation to English, was the theme of where I was going to be going. I was just always going to have to get in the pit and fight whenever I could, right?
Right.
So that's really, you know, how I would summarize, even to this day. There's still so much inequity. There are still so many things that we have to get in the pit and fight for. It's just that we're so fragmented. All these
Mm.
communities are so fragmented. And I finally see some hope. I see hope where we're not as competitive anymore. We're not as fragmented. I see that there's so much more hope than I've seen in my entire 47 years.
Mhm. And you talk about that fight and that talk of you talk about advocating for yourself because otherwise the opportunities wouldn't be there because they weren't in place. And how much of that do you think is let's ask about the nature versus nurture or personality versus situational. How much of that do you think is part of you and what you bring in as an individual to have it in you to just fight for those things versus coming into a situation where you're forced to fight for it because the situation doesn't present the opportunity automatically. What do you think about that?
Right. I think it's hard because when you look at your statistical outcomes as
Mhm.
a Latina from the Bronx, my statistical outcomes is the same, however we look at it, right? So I think just wanting to defy some of that was important to me, right? That was going to be something that probably fuels me now, right? I mean, it doesn't matter that you don't understand why structural things exist or why systemic things exist, and you could understand it, from a certain point, but then as you live it and you realize the discriminatory practice that occurs, and you see it. So Brazilian, I'm African, indigenous, and white. So it wasn't something that I grew up thinking like, oh, the Black community is separate from me. The Black community is me too, right? So when I looked at the outcomes that could occur for any one of us, I think it was harder to go out and try to actively go against some of that grain and go against what was to be, right? But growing up with those circumstances around you, it makes you very aware of how truncated your outcomes are, right? I mean, you get the choice of selling drugs, your body, or jail, right? So when you look at those things and you think about what you want, I think fighting for all of us to have a better place is something that takes more risk, right? Because it is easier to go into the informal sector. It is easier to do a lot of other things, and it is a little bit more complicated to get into a different zone of advocacy, a different zone, because it's all advocacy points, right? Each aspect of communities of color, it's all different advocacy points. But you know, it depends on, you know, where you want to move that needle, and how you're going to move that needle. And really that's just a differentiator. But in truth, I mean, every single statistic that you confront as a Black or Latina woman, you have just the same chance. You have just the same chance, you know?
And so as you were growing up and kind of navigating your way through both your education and subsequently your work and your research, you obviously had to advocate for yourself to create these positions. And we met on the Clubhouse platform, which has been great. And I see that on there you are a huge STEM advocate for girls and women. Tell me more about your advocacy on that platform and beyond, going, beyond advocating for yourself as a young woman growing up and going through the process to being an advocate for others.
I think it starts from just the understanding of where things don't always materialize for women of color. And I located that to be an access issue, right? So one of the things that I have always championed for is we won't have, right? Like I will keep saying that, like the circumstances won't be ideal. We have to create them, right? Like those, that to me is the single driving force. I mean, I didn't like throughout my career, I was the only one. I'm from New York. Come on. Like, other Latina scientists. Come on, right? Come on. Right. So I think it's from that point, right, that you start to having to destroy those barriers, right? So I think now it's two things. It's me wanting to be, I created the person I wish I would have had when I was growing up. If I would have had somebody that said, right, and I did have it, right? I did have professors along the way that said, you should apply for this. You should definitely do this. I mean, I didn't get to the University of Michigan, right, without that kind of mentorship, right? Mm-hmm. I always had faculty of color pushing me further than I even thought was possible for myself, right? So it wasn't just to get pushed in a direction. I think you need access to things that can further you in what you're going to be doing. And it's not just about the degree, it's about the problem you're solving in the future. So how do we create access points that get you there faster, right? How do we connect you to the types of resources that will expedite your research, expedite your career, and advance science and advance these perspectives? Because that's the one single thing that we see in research is always that this comprehensive thinking and diversity of thinking is really the nexus and the matrix of how we get to solutions faster. So don't we want to see our future scientists and STEMers get to things faster than we did? Like, and seriously, Nancy, I was blazing through everything to make cycles faster and faster and faster. So wouldn't I love to see that next group of young doctors, young science, young engineers, young mathematicians go and produce even faster than what I did? So I could sit back and say, well, the one issue was access. The one issue is that women of color love to say this about themselves all the time, is we don't look out for one another. So why don't we create structures that does, right? Mm-hmm. So let's break that apart and let's start challenging it, and let's start creating what we think needs to exist, not even from the clinical and healthcare side, right? Because we know it needs to exist. It's just getting to that point. We also need to break barriers down, right? So I think it would be just easier for us to start creating structures, and women of color in STEM and brain health start dismantling some of those structures that it's just an access point, right? It shouldn't be like a student shouldn't walk into our room and say, you know what, I'm in my, X year in my postdoc, and I would love to get a job at Facebook. I would love to get a job at Google. Well, that's an easy partnership for me to form, and then just get the head of internships and head of engineering in our rooms and get that started for the potential candidates. So I think, I mean, it's my small way of trying to create systems that help, the future STEMers and future doctors, because now, you know, I was trained 20 years ago in interdisciplinary. Now so many programs are interdisciplinary. We're finally understanding the multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary approaches to problems. So I think we're at a great, we're at a greater advantage now than we've ever been before.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that there's so many different technological differences that is there, but still, academia and is still an archaic system. So you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And it sounds like through that process, for not only yourself, but what you're trying to create for our next generation is sort of tackling limiting beliefs that we tend to hand ourselves, right? And how do you help somebody learn that they can talk themselves out of the limiting beliefs? How do we support other individuals in talking themselves out or talking them out of limiting beliefs? It sounds like you had mentors and you had professors that showed you the way that you could achieve so much more than you thought was possible. And things like, oh, I'm not good enough, or I might fail, or oh, somebody else has already done this, or I don't have enough time. There's no way I could ever achieve this. How do you tackle that, and how do you encourage others to?
The first thing I would say is just delete certain words from your
Mm,
vocabulary. Delete no, shouldn't, can't, don't. Delete those words, because you're in the world trying to solve a problem. People telling you no, can't, don't, shouldn't, they are creating a problem, right? So they're a barrier to addressing a solution, and you're here as a solution. So that's the first thing, right? But the other thing too is that I know that we don't do this enough as women. We don't sit back and think of our trajectory and our success. We never think about our track record, like that we've done over and over again, right? Graduating with honors at any point is already a marker of success, and that took time. Like, I know that part of American ideology is this to look at the end product and say, wow, that's what this person can achieve. But we didn't see the 25 years, the 15 years, the 28, the 48 years it took, right? So even if you look at your track record from elementary school, high school, college, undergrad, grad, you demonstrated a track record already. And that track record of performance is already an indicator of what you could achieve. You don't have you knew what went into it. So in a sense, we have our own blueprint, right? We've always had our blueprint. We always knew what it took to excel to that next level. I mean, none of these things, as much as people want to look at women of color and think it just landed in your lap, or some kind of way. And no, it took to get to grad. It took a lot of sacrifice from an undergrad to to even high school. Like, there are many of us that did not have the liberties to go hang out with your friends and be social. It was study. Your job is A's, right? Your job is to excel, right? Or you know what I mean? Like, it what you sacrificed along the way. So each time you're confronted with a new hurdle, I just look at it like I just got accustomed to, it's fine. I'm always going to be the underdog. Okay, it's fine, right? The other part that I have to just say to myself is, it this is not going to come in any shape or form overnight. It won't. If I'm offered something and people are surprised, I'm like, I could look back and tell you about 38 years of hard work, right? So even though we we can set goals that we think are like dream level goals, and then we wonder, how can we get there? Or, why would I get there? Or any of these beliefs. And all you have to do is look back and say, how did I get that one academic scholarship? For how did I get the first placement in the university? Like, how was I one of the first behavioral scientists in this country? How was I one of them? Right? Like, everything that you did started from a point, right? And that could have happened at 5 years old. It could have happened at 25. At some point, you already demonstrated a track record of success. And you just have to know that you have to modify that blueprint a little to continue to project out that success.
Right.
But there will constantly be people that say, no, can't, don't, shouldn't, you're 1%, you're less than 2, there's no women in here. Forget it. You will always be the only woman. You'll always be the only, like, everything that you think, that will always be the case. It does not preclude you from being successful and getting the things that you have already demonstrated a track record of success with.
Right. And, and when, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about how, obviously goal setting and shooting for the stars and trying to chase what we really want is important, but also just remembering that it's not the destination, it's the journey. Right. And all of these
Mhm.
things that we have gone through. And I'm sure you've lived that and experienced that as well. I want to ask you a question because I would be remiss if I didn't ask about this. I would love to hear about the science and the inspiration behind the technique that you developed, your happiness hypothesis, or otherwise known as H2O. Can you please tell the audience more about that? I know they would love to hear about it.
Sure. So once I left, I left infectious disease, right? I left HIV/AIDS work to really explore the wellness side. And I got to say that, the relationship decision making tool was really uh necessity, right? That was that like, that's always the mother of innovation. Um so I think one of the things that I sat back and thought about with all of my friends in New York, and all of my friends that I knew that were high performing, high achievers, successful, attractive, and single, one of the biggest things I thought of was why we failed so much at relationships, right? Why we couldn't excel. We excelled in every other area of our lives except for relationships. So I think one of the biggest things that drove me to behavioral science was always the same question, right? It was always decision and choice, right? Like, that's what drove me into behavioral science, was when we look at what your outcomes in life become as a result of decisions and choices, what does that look like? So when I applied that kind of hard-nosed thinking to my own life in areas that I didn't think I excelled in, like relationships, I had to explore what was the series of poor decision making that I made? What was the series of choices I accepted for myself? And what ways could I improve that those outcomes for myself? So when I thought about hard nosing it that way, I I decided to act as a scientist, even with my own inquiry, right? So I created my own tongue-in-cheek relationship blog that documented my process throughout online dating and in real life dating in New York.
Mhm.
And when I thought about what I was going to name that blog, I thought about, what do you consistently say to yourself about your poor decisions? And what do you say about your poor choices? So then I landed on you're just a dumbass.com. I love it.
That's fantastic. And and I love how, a lot of times I think people don't think about relationships and those kinds of interactions as being something that is scientific, but I love how you apply your experience in behavioral science to it. And so I think it's amazing. It definitely has a role there. Now, you've heard the saying, just to switch gears, that you are the sum of the 8 people with whom you spend the most time. Now, rather than just asking who those 8 people are, my spin on that is to ask if you could have a dinner for four, including yourself, with any women from any time in history. Who are your dinner companions and why? It's a hard one. I'm throwing you a curveball.
You are. You are, because I don't know that it would be any different than what I had in life. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? Like, you know, my mentors in undergrad were Dr. Darlene DeFore and Dr. Marimba Ani. And my mom passed away 5 years ago. I would want my mom. And at Michigan, I had Dr. Lorraine Gutierrez. So those are my four.
That sounds like a pretty good dinner party. Well, I always love asking my guests if they had one single piece of advice to give someone who wants to either just excel and succeed in a male-dominated field or follow in your footsteps. What would that advice be?
I think I'm going to close with the same statement I've been saying, right? The right conditions won't always exist. You have to create them. You will have to continuously create them throughout your career and your life goals.
I think that there's no way to lead a life worth living and to, leave our footprint and our legacy without acknowledging that. And that we can't just sit here and be passive and allow life to happen to us. We need to create it. And that's what I'm hearing from you. It has been amazing, amazing having you on, and I've learned so much, and I'm so inspired. And so I thank you for your time, and I think our listeners will definitely feel the same way. Thank you so much, Clarissa.
Thank you.
Awesome. So I'm going to end the podcast portion of it there, and let's see if we have. I'm looking over at Clubhouse now, and I know we've had some folks kind of drift in and out. If there are any questions, I'd see Michelle is in the room, so I would like to, before we close the podcast or close the Clubhouse room, I would like to give Michelle an opportunity to raise her hand if she has any questions. But if not, then I will go ahead and close out the Clubhouse room. Going once, going twice. All right, I'll go ahead and close out the Clubhouse room, and Clarissa will finish up here in the room. Thank you all for attending. Okay. All right. So